Hey, hi and welcome everyone. Today we are going to talk about different ways of making web applications extensible. And a common need for extending web applications is to integrate code and third-party aspects. And this is something that Contentful is very important and central to what we do. And that's why we have the application framework and its ecosystem around that allow people actually to integrate third-party aspects in the Contentful web application. And this is why we have here today Chris Sove, Principal Front-End Developer of Shopify, and Lorenz Weiss, Senior Front-End Engineer at Contentful, to discuss Remote UI, which is an interesting development on how sandboxing of third-party code and third-party UI elements can be made. And Chris and Lorenz, glad to have you here today.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here.
And yeah, maybe you can spend a minute each just introducing yourselves so who is listening learns about you. Chris, would you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Thanks again for having me. So I've been at Shopify for almost 9 years now. I've spent most of that time working on Shopify's admin, which is where a merchant manages their online store. And we're very similar to Contentful. We have a number of different companies, many actually at this point, who want to integrate into that product and allow merchants to manage both their online store and their integration with that other service from one user interface. But over the past couple of years, I have actually been working on Shopify's checkout, which surprisingly also has some fairly similar requirements because we have a hosted checkout that Shopify completely runs, in which we want to be the main controller of the page contents. And so we have a similar need to have third parties who want to have additional content in the checkout flow show there. So I've spent most of my time over these past 9 years working on front-end architecture problems, like shifting over to React and GraphQL or adopting TypeScript. And this is kind of the big one over the past few years, is how we find a modern extensible approach that can be performant and allow us to continue to innovate on our design language and design system.
Perfect. Thank you. And Lorenz?
Hi, I'm Lorenz. I'm a software engineer at Contentful. I've been here for 2 years, and all of the time I'm working in the team extensibility, which is mainly focused on with the topic we're talking here about is about extending Contentful with like third-party integrations, like for example the most famous app framework, and also other things like webhooks and yeah, stuff like that. And yeah, we are kind of exploring new ways of doing it, and I kind of did a little experiment and proof of concept around the remote UI as maybe a potential next step for our app framework, and yeah, I guess that's why I'm here.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, and as you were saying, Lorenz, when there is the need of integrating third-party logic and user interface aspects in a web application, the usual path to do it is really to utilize the iframe construct. And this obviously defines then way to control the protocol of interaction between the hosting web application and the embedded application. But a sole approach obviously comes with pros and cons. And yeah, maybe Chris, you can talk a bit about what was the motivation and the reasons pushing you and your team on looking for different solutions to the more usual iframe approach.
Yeah, well, I mean, we like many companies, I think, do have a version of the iframe approach as well. I think the years of experience with that is a main driver in what led us towards an alternative solution. Iframes are definitely great, as you say. They're like the web's primitive for this. They have a mechanism for communicating between the top frame and the subframe. And they give full flexibility of what user interface can actually be presented, because in the end, it's just a web page under there. But the main issues that we were encountering, or that we continue to encounter, honestly, are that web browsers don't particularly love iframes, especially when they're cross-origin iframes, which most like app-based systems kind of require a cross-origin iframe. And so in that context, cookies are almost useless. And so you have to develop your whole own authentication system. What we were also seeing is we have a pretty large component library, Polaris, but iframes, because they're separate domains, don't generally share or aren't able to share any assets between them. And so each individual iframe is, on top of being a pretty large construct to begin with, has to also load all of the JavaScript for React or however they want to render their UI and the entire component library. And that's being done for every single application that's embedded into the main one. And if the main application happens to update its assets or design language, the other ones have to manually follow suit to keep up. So there were a lot of issues for us with apps slowing down our ability to make progress, and with being unable to use kind of standard web conventions like cookies in order to do things like authentication. And so we felt we needed to kind of drop to a different layer, kind of a lower level layer that allowed us to almost rebuild the parts of the iframe that were important to us. And that's kind of where remote UI came out of.
Yeah, and then remote UI is, again, it is a new approach. And maybe can you talk about the foundations of remote UI? Like, what are the fundamental ideas?
Yeah, so remote UI is a system for creating user interface elements in one JavaScript context and transporting them to a different JavaScript context. That's kind of the basic gist of it. So the main goal is to allow, in Shopify's case, and I think in Contentful's case as well, third parties to create a tree of UI components in a sandbox of some sort, and then to have that UI magically be transported to the main page where it can be rendered natively with all the regular UI that application is rendering. The mechanism is based on, you don't need post message, but it's based on post message because most of the sandboxes available to us in a browser are post message. In Shopify's case, we actually use both an iframe and web workers in our solutions that involve remote UI, both of which rely on post message under the hood. So remote UI works just fine with the limitations of post message, most notably that things like functions can't be serialized over post message. One of the big selling features of remote UI is that it takes care of serializing functions, which are extremely common in a user interface world. You can think of every on-click or on-change event callback as being one of those kinds of functions that you need to serialize when you're trying to render a tree of UI. And it takes care of serializing those just fine across JavaScript contexts and cleaning up memory after it's done, which is traditionally one of the trickier parts of doing these kinds of proxying across a web worker or iframe boundary.
Perfect. Yeah, it's a very, very clever solution, and I like how you explained all the elements of it. And maybe can you also say something about why this is a completely framework agnostic solution, like, that doesn't rely necessarily on the use of React or a selected framework? It can be used with, but doesn't force you to buy into any of those.
Yeah, remote UI is definitely inspired by modern JavaScript frameworks, but what we kind of saw when we looked at the frameworks was that most of them boiled down at the end of the day to the ability to render components, which have a name and a set of properties. And like all of them add more on top of that and add like reactivity and lots of cool stuff. But at the end of the day, most of them end up just generating that tree of UI components. And I'm sure if you're a developer who's worked on big complicated apps, at some point you've probably built like a server-driven UI API where you're sending that tree of UI components down. So everyone's kind of, I think, familiar with this type props like pairing and expressing a tree of components that way. Yeah. So yeah, what we saw when we looked at JavaScript frameworks was that most of them kind of boiled down to this having a component that has a type, which is a name, and a set of properties or attributes, whatever you want to call them across the different frameworks. And so remote UI's understanding of a tree of components is just that. It doesn't understand anything about state or context or anything of that nature that you might see in a real JavaScript framework. at the end of the day, it just boils your tree of components down to a name and a prop, and then creates a tree of that and sends it over the wire. And so you can create that tree of components from almost any JavaScript framework that exists, or no JavaScript framework at all. So Remote UI comes with we call it a vanilla UI fairly often, which is just a simple JavaScript API for creating and appending nodes to a tree. But there's also a React adapter that uses React's ability to create custom reconcilers to take a React tree and output it to Remote UI. We have an example with Vue and with other frameworks as well. So it's something that as long as you can take your framework and output it to something that isn't exactly the DOM, the framework is totally capable of outputting the style of tree that Remote UI expects. We also actually are working at Shopify on a DOM adapter of Remote UI. So it really, we're almost kind of like coiling the snake in on itself a little bit here, but the notion there is that you can represent the DOM as creating a tree of components as well. In the end, that's what the DOM is a tree of nodes. And so you can take that tree of nodes and convert it into the same format that Remote UI expects and transition it across the wire. And when you have a DOM adapter, basically every framework that can target the DOM all of a sudden just works with Remote UI as well. So we have examples of using Preact in a worker that generates DOM, which then gets transitioned into the component model of Remote UI, sent across the wire and rendered natively on the host. So there's lots of different options when you kind of boil the problem down to the very simple tree of component name and component props.
Yeah, that's great, because it's agnosticism that essentially opens a whole set of possibilities of combining it with anything that is compatible with the idea without enforcing anything specific that needs to be used around it. And yeah, you spoke a bit about how the solution works, but maybe now can you make some examples of what are some components that the framework is used with within Shopify?
Yeah, so I'd say like Remote UI is like, it helps you with the generating of the JavaScript sandbox and the communication between the host page and the sandbox, and also helps you with creating this tree of UI components. But you basically start with nothing when you're using Remote UI. It's a system that you basically have to choose what is available, and anything that you don't explicitly make available just won't do anything when the third party who's using your API tries to go and create a UI component. So you start with a total blank slate of UI components and build up from there. We have built a set of UI components for the different surface areas that use Remote UI that's very similar to any design system that you would see for like a typical web application, including Polaris, which is our admin design system. Where you'll see the like basic visual components like text fields and buttons and layout components and forms and all of this kind of stuff. And all of them have the same kinds of APIs that you would see for especially a React component library. So you'll have your text field, its value prop, label prop, and on change. But we're totally in control of which components are available and which properties they have. And we can even, make validations on the host page that ensure that props that are passed are only the ones that are allowed, so that we can have things like some extensions able to render components with some props and others not able to use those props for like internal use cases. But you're not restricted to purely visual components with Remote UI, just like you wouldn't be restricted to purely visual components with a more complicated front-end framework like React. You can make the components mean anything you want. So we have some very like domain-specific components that we also expose. One example in the checkout is that we have a like a consent checkbox component that you can render, that from the perspective of the partner who's rendering it, they don't really like understand what it's doing. They just know that for a particular use case, they need to render that checkbox, and we, Shopify, will interpret what the user does with that checkbox for our own purposes. And so they just render that like very domain relevant component. We choose how it renders natively on our side. We track whether it's checked independently of what the developer tells us. And then we can use that for like a consent collection that we wouldn't want to just delegate to the third party who may say, yes, the user checked the checkbox when they hadn't actually. So really the choice is totally up to you. On top of the components though, we also have a collection of APIs, because if you could just render UI components without interacting with the host page in any way, it wouldn't be particularly useful. And so this is, again, totally up to you. You start with nothing here and choose what you want to expose. In our case, a lot of the APIs we've exposed have been for reading data from the host application. I spend most of my time working on the checkout, and there's tons of data in the checkout that a developer might want to read to change how they render the line items in the checkout, the customer details, shipping and payment methods, all the stuff that you end up kind of generating through the process of the checkout. And so we give APIs where you can read and subscribe to changes in all of that data in a fine-grained way so that you can quickly be updated and adjust your rendering in response to things happening in the host page, which is really cool to see kind of the extension collaboratively exist in the checkout and without needing to be part of the main application or get like kind of just events in the ether. They just get events about the data that they care about changing and then the updated value, and they can go ahead and render based on that. We also have APIs for mutating. So that's kind of the other side of it. If you're able to read, that's great, but you also might maybe want to change some things. So we have the ability for the extension to, for instance, mutate the line items of the checkout by just calling a function, because it's all just looks like function calls to the extension developer. And that's great because then the host is in the middle of that interaction. We see that the extension wants to mutate the line items, and we can decide how that handles. And so in the case of checkout, we might make an API call or just change a little bit of local state or however is appropriate to handle that change, and then send the updated values to all the extensions that care about the line items. So I think those are kind of the rough shape of the APIs. You've got components, you've got data reading APIs, and you've got data mutating APIs. But again, it's really up to the individual host application that's using remote UI to pick the set of APIs that make sense for them. I'm really interested to hear kind of some of the APIs that you folks have considered in the context of your use case.
Yeah, sure. Maybe Lorenz, you developed a kind of prototype around the remote UI, so you can tell a bit about your experience, what you picked of the set of possibilities of remote UI, and yeah, what did you learn?
Yeah, so I think we kind of face similar problems to what you were describing before. So when we are like rendering iframes in different locations to like customize the editorial experience in Contentful most of the time, and we kind of face similar problems of like the limitations of iframes, that like if you want to render a drop down, like it always overflows the iframe and all of that. But I remember once there was like, we wanted to introduce a new location, which was basically rendering small widgets in a list. So it was like very painful to have like, I don't know, 20 iframes in a list, which always renders the same website kind of. And we kind of was looking into some solutions for that. And like we were looking, for example, into a declarative way of like a low code solution where you write the JSON that represents the DOM that gets rendered in there. And therefore I was also looking a bit into the React rendering mechanism, and which you, Chris, said is basically just boils down to like this: you get an input and you output something else, and like the reconciling in between is handled by the engine. And then I will, someone pointed me to remote UI to also send over that piece of part, or like let it generate by the React renderer and then send it over to the web app and then render it in there again. And therefore I kind of looked into it a little bit for this part and did a small experiment around it, which turned out to be working quite well. I was also yeah, really love that it's framework agnostic, and it also has this, plugin based kind of way of doing it. So there was also already like a React plugin that was basically already doing what I was thinking of this rendering a JSON and then sending it over with a post message. And it turned out to be quite successful. Sure, it probably cannot replace the current setup as we are right now, because like a lot of these apps that are rebuilt are very custom in what they're rendering. So there are like tons of different elements that are rendered there. So we cannot, kind of migrate them over. But I think as a new version, there's definitely a possibility to use it for the next version.
Yeah, and we talk about the advantages of remote UI versus some of the aspects of iframe. And if we want to reason a bit about the limitations and boundaries within which remote UI is recommendable and so on, yeah, both Chris and Lorenz, like, how would you think to think about these? In which case you would consider it's well applicable? What are the elements to watch for a good implementation?
I love this is always my favorite part, because I feel like a lot of I have the benefit of it's just like a fun little open source project, so I don't have to sell it really hard to anyone. But I feel like often open source projects kind of sell their thing as being good for everything, and I'm always very much the opposite. I'm like, don't use this thing unless it's like super clear it's perfect for you. And I think remote UI is like absolutely fits into that category too. It's way overkill for most versions of this problem. And even if you are rendering UI from a third party, I would say if you have kind of a typical use case of you're just rendering like almost full screen content from a third party and you want them to have full flexibility, like that is what an iframe is for. As I mentioned earlier, remote UI, you start from nothing. And so every little bit of the DOM that you basically want to recreate, whether it's like the ability to add a background color, do a box, or the ability to render an input or anything like that, has to be recreated by you, defining components that then get rendered on the host. And so it's a lot more work for you to set up as the developer. There's also some restrictions on how you can design the APIs that may be a little unfamiliar to some folks. In particular, since we're going over generally a process boundary in JavaScript, all function calls have to be asynchronous. That's probably one of the biggest ones. So you can't recreate some APIs that have to be synchronous in the DOM. For instance, like event listeners can prevent default on the event. That's one thing that you just can't do when defining a component via remote UI, because the event listener becomes asynchronous when it crosses over the bridge, and then it can no longer prevent default on the event. So you have to develop your own little system against that, or add APIs that allow them to prevent default in another way, or something like that. And so that I think like adds a little bit of extra kind of component API restriction that may like bristles or may not be ideal for some folks. You also have to, with remote UI, you have to define the vanilla layer, and then the other layers come on top. And so there's some things that are much easier to express in a like proper JavaScript framework like React or Vue that are a little bit harder to express in the simpler model that remote UI has. So for example, in React, it's trivial to pass React elements as props to other React elements, or in Vue, they have slots that allow you to inject content in. Remote UI has some ways of like allowing you to pass a tree of UI components as a prop to another tree of UI components, but it's much more awkward and hard to set up. Versus just leaning into one JavaScript framework and relying on what it does that then gets output to the DOM in a regular iframe. So I'd say those are definitely some of the restrictions to think about. You'll also want to consider that every time you render a piece of UI with remote UI, you do still need to render some sort of JavaScript sandbox, execute a script, at least one script inside of that sandbox, and then it will be ready to start rendering user interface. And that can be a bit of an issue if you want it to feel like the absolute most native that it can, because it's always going to be delayed relative to UI that you could have rendered natively yourself. So we spend a lot of time in checkout working around this particular limitation to try and come up with loading strategies that allow us to like render the extension while the user's already waiting for something else, or show some sort of estimated size or estimated skeleton content of the UI while it's still rendering in a background thread. So you end up signing yourself up for some more complexities if you're really focused on fine-tuning the performance and user experience of the content that appears. So yeah, I think those would be the ones I would watch out for.
Yeah, and Lorenz, from your side, any reflection on limitations or any question for Chris, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, one thing definitely, as Chris said in the beginning, is around this, you have to define the elements yourself you want to be rendered in. So it also boils down to kind of the excellence of your design system and your component library. So like if it's complete, you basically can build everything. But if you want to, for example, use something else, like, I don't know, you want to build an app that renders material design for whatever reason, this probably is not possible. But again, this is also as well like the advantage of it, because it kind of still keeps the branded look of your application in place. So if like, even if you have third-party integrations rendered in different locations, it still looks like native because it's the same design system, the same component library. So I think this, like, for me, goes both ways. I'm pretty sure that like a lot of use cases where it will not work because the component library or like the components you provide will not offer that the functionality. But I think most of them can be solved with it. And then, you know, also you have always the same version of the component library, of the same version of the design system. So everything looks kind of, yeah, more in place than it sometimes is before.
Yeah, it's a great point about the like component library being such a critical element. Like, I think if you're a company considering this and you don't have a strong component library and a strong like design system practice, I would say like work on that first. That's absolutely critical. Because yeah, you're gonna have to do the whole work of basically like being the browser vendor and deciding what elements are available. And if you don't have practice at that, you're gonna definitely make a little bit of a mess your first few times through. So it's great to have a bit of an established component library. You can use that as the base to start like defining the components that Remote UI is able to render. But without that, it's going to be definitely a big pain.
Yeah, exactly.
And yeah, Lorenz, I think you had a question about one-to-one communication or relationship.
Yeah, so I'm essentially, like, as I said at the beginning, like the use case we had was a lot of, or like the problems we faced at the beginning with our current setup was that we have like pages where there are like, I don't know, 20 different iframes that are rendering apps, and most of them like maybe rendering the same app. So you have like 20 iframes that are rendering the same applications. And when I was trying out Remote UI, I was kind of trying to beat that problem. So I couldn't really find a way of doing it like that there's like a one-to-many relationship of like the root and the receiver. So I was wondering if this is maybe also a use case you're facing of like having one hidden iframe or one web worker that kind of distributes the UI to different places. Also thinking about not only having like a widget that's statically rendered in one place, but maybe, you know, having it different places, a more dynamic way of extending the application.
Yeah, sure. So again, the like theme of this should be like you choose what you want to see, and then Remote UI is like it can happen, but it's on you to do the work. So in our implementation of Remote UI at Shopify, we definitely do have this same use case. In the checkout, for example, we have extension points, which is what we call like spots that you can target with an extension. I don't think I even defined an extension earlier, but anyways, we call the thing that uses Remote UI an extension in the context of Shopify, and you can target extension points, which are locations in the UI. One of those locations in the UI in checkout is render after each line item in the checkout. And so underneath each one, you have something. Potentially there can be hundreds of line items in the checkout. And we certainly, to your point, don't want to be rendering an iframe or even a web worker necessarily for each one of those. But then there's a bit of a balance between like minimizing the number of sandboxes and minimizing like shared sandboxes between potential like untrusted parties. So you don't necessarily want to have two different developers have their code running in the exact same sandbox, because then they have basically a side channel to communicate with one another, which could potentially be a problem because we do like impose restrictions on what each of those extensions is able to do. That's sometimes dependent on the third party or the access scopes that they have enabled on their app. And so the balance that we've struck at Shopify is that we create a single iframe that all web workers are going to be created inside of. And we do that so that the iframe can be on a separate domain, and therefore all the workers inside of the iframe are on a separate domain and won't send cookies and similar credentials along in network requests. And then within that iframe, if we have an extension point that is rendered multiple times, the same worker is shared for all code that renders into that extension point. We'll just create the one worker, load the JavaScript into it, and then send a message as many times as we have items that says, hey, render. And then usually there's an additional piece of context for each of them that lets them understand, well, which item am I actually rendered against? So with each of those calls, we send in like the target line item ID, for example. So we end up having just one extension running, but it is executing many different like little JavaScript functions that allow it to render each of those pieces of UI individually. But then if you are a separate developer, or even if it's the same developer, but it's a different extension targeting a different extension point, then that goes into a separate worker. So that's the balance of like isolation and restricting the process utilization that we've kind of found. But it's totally up to you. You could, in theory, just put every single bit of code on the main thread. You don't even need a JavaScript sandbox, because remote UI is just based on like a function call between the two sides. So you could go all the way from having everything on the main thread coexisting with your own code, potentially sending network requests as you, which I don't imagine too many people would want, all the way to potentially the like full restriction of a totally separate iframe and or worker per piece of JavaScript code that's extending into your product. So it's really whatever works best for your use case.
Yeah, I mean, this is great regarding the possibility of being able to think in such a fine grain regarding what you can isolate, how many times, and across different actors or different applications of the same actor. It's really a good playground to have to really manage how to think and balance performance, security, and so on. And maybe while I said the performance, I think, Chris, you touched on some of the performance elements that influence how well the library can perform. Yeah, some more consideration on what are the main performance criteria and parameters for this solution?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the big performance issues that it is meant to solve are the duplication of the assets in the iframes, which ends up being really expensive when you have a bunch of iframes being rendered, because each one, if it's a separate domain, will have its own assets. They don't even if it's the exact same assets, if it's separate domains in each iframe, all modern browsers partition the cache, and so they'll all get separate versions of those assets. And iframes are also like very expensive constructs to spin up in a web browser. And so you don't because you have to create a whole document model for them, and they have a bunch of their own storage associated. And so if you can kind of minimize that down to just a web worker, then you're restricting the amount of memory that you're going to continue to utilize as you render more of these things. But one of the really nice things that you get out of following this approach is something that we've talked on the web for a long time about, but is really hard to accomplish regularly, which is off main thread rendering. If you can put your code into a web worker that is running on a totally separate thread, it will never block user input. And so one of the really nice things about using this for third parties especially is that you don't have to worry about them potentially shipping an infinite loop that locks up a user's browser entirely, because worst case scenario, they're just locking up their own web worker and their UI will become unresponsive, but the rest of the page will continue functioning just fine. So yeah, there's the advantage of not having the assets to pay for. There's the advantage of running off main thread and all of the benefits that come along with that. But you do still have like some cost associated with this relative to rendering more natively, because you will still have to load that minimum amount of JavaScript into the sandboxes that you create that allow the third party to communicate back and forth with the host page. And if you are using the React adapter, for example, React is not free, and every single extension will itself have to pay the cost of using React, which for React Reconciler, I think is about 20 kilobytes gzipped or so. And so if you really want the like closest to the metal thing, that's kind of why there is a vanilla API for remote UI, and it's not just totally tied to React or totally tied to Vue. The vanilla version of remote UI is only about 2 or 3 kilobytes. And so you can put that into a web worker with relatively minimal cost, and that's great for extensions that don't need the full weight of a proper JavaScript framework. So lots of performance considerations to bring in, some that weigh positively and some that weigh negatively. But if you're comparing it to an iframe, I think like iframes are enormously expensive to construct,
yeah.
and the assets are problematic. So it's definitely a win in that regard.
Yeah, and I also think it gives you many options of managing your own performance. Like you said, I can use React or choose to not use it, depending by what's the balance of complexity and performance that I need. And yeah, we touched on many different aspects regarding what's the solution at present times, and looking a bit at the future and also the landscape of other possible alternatives. Chris, yeah, how do you see the development of this work in terms of the future of remote UI or other promising work that you've seen elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, remote UI itself, it's not done by any means, but it's like we haven't honestly touched it that much over the past couple of years that we've been using it. We kind of locked in a basic feature set that's been extremely useful for us. And at Shopify, almost everything we're doing with remote UI is in the layers on top of it. So more components, like better component design. We're working a lot on how we do the APIs for these UI extensions. In particular, I mentioned earlier about that, like those data reading APIs where you can read some data in the checkout, subscribe to data. What we'd really like to do is an even kind of more advanced, but like nicer developer experience system where you just define a GraphQL query that we will store with your extension. And then we will continuously execute that GraphQL query and give you the results. So you don't have to worry about like subscribing to a particular piece of data or whatever. You just tell us like, here's the data that I want, and we'll take care of giving you the latest version of that in your extension. And none of that is based on remote UI. It's really just all based on the host choosing what APIs to expose to the extensions and how the host manages its state in order to send those updates. So remote UI, I would say, is like in a good state and will continue to have this basic feature set. We're going to add a nice polished version of that DOM adapter that I mentioned earlier, which I think is going to be kind of the last bit of extending an olive branch to developers who already know the web and can work with the DOM really well, because then you can bring any DOM capable framework to the party inside of the worker or inside of the sandbox, and it can work just fine with remote UI. But I do think that there's like the real goal, I think, would be to have this pattern be something that browsers just did for us naturally, because right now we still have to pay 20 kilobytes or so all together on the worker side and on the host side in order to set up a system that can proxy the calls and manage the memory and do all of the work that remote UI has to do. There's been a few proposals that have worked towards some of what remote UI does. One of my colleagues at Shopify, Jason Miller, who also wrote Preact, he made a proposal a few years ago for, I believe he called it Worker DOM, which was basically a web component, but where the implementation is inside of a worker. That gets you the like process isolation benefits, but doesn't get you the you are in full control of what HTML elements the third party can render. Because if you can render a web component, you can just render whatever arbitrary DOM that you want and be on your way. But it definitely covers a big piece of it, which is how do you initialize and continue to update a piece of UI that's controlled from a different JavaScript environment. So I think that's kind of the main like standards track work that I have seen towards this. There have also been a few different projects that handle similar problems in slightly different ways that I think will potentially like take some of what we currently use remote UI for at Shopify and do a little bit better job of it. I imagine you folks have probably seen Party Town before. It has, if you look at the kind of what it says on the tin, it's doing something somewhat similar here, which is run third-party code in a web worker with communication. It actually doesn't have the asynchronous restriction that remote UI does, because they use web workers or atomics when they're available in order to do kind of some wild shenanigans to make asynchronous calls into synchronous calls. But I think like it will be a really great solution if all you need is to run basically a headless piece of code in another thread that can still like communicate back to the DOM, but doesn't need to manage a tree of UI components necessarily. So yeah, I think that's where I see things going. Definitely, I hope that remote UI shrinks in terms of its importance in our portfolio to the point where hopefully in the longer term future, it's just a native part of the browser and we can rely on it directly. We do, though, I should mention, we do also render these things natively. That's maybe one of the other benefits of remote UI that you can get if you are a team that really needs it, is that this just requires a JavaScript sandbox, and all of the native platforms also have JavaScript sandboxes that are super fast and super good. And so we execute the exact same extensions inside of our native apps and render them to native UI elements instead of to web UI elements. So there's still a benefit of having a lower level thing that is not connected to the DOM that allows you that flexibility to work across platforms and to use the same underlying extension code. But for the browser use case, there's definitely some potential for future advancements that actually take this into the platform.
Yeah, we certainly also hope that, like you say, that there's going to be more support directly in the browser to work with this kind of primitives, because it is getting a common pattern. But yeah, very interesting your point on if it's lower level, it's also applicable on native. I actually find it a pretty attractive aspect as well, which is yet another point of how flexible and how many possibilities this library open. Okay.
Yeah, I always like, I'm a little cautious about that one, because again, it's like the thing that sells you that it can do everything. I would say, even though Shopify uses React Native a lot internally, I am not personally a big React Native fan, because I think it does a little bit too much of this kind of like selling that you can build once and run everywhere, and that's like, it is a promise that has gotten better over the years, but I still think like the best UIs are natively written. But for a use case like this, where we're just talking about integrations, it's not the main content of the page, I think it is a pretty ideal fit to have the integration developer just build one version of it, because that's all you can ever hope for them to build for your platform, and to have it run in all of the locations, at least in a best effort way. I think that's a pretty neat piece. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah. And now we also covered the future, a bit of platforms other than the web. And that's maybe a good point to conclude this very interesting conversation. So thank you again, Chris, and thank you, Lorenz. And yeah, looking forward to maybe follow up when there is a further advancement on the front of integrating web applications. Thank you.
So sounds good. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot.